Testing. Testing. Yes. Okay. Good morning to everyone in our Global Markets Theater. We're going to be kicking off today's first session of day 3 at Wind Europe Bilbao, which is on the topic of looking ahead to the COP27 conference in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt in November this year. A warm welcome as well to those who are joining us online. We're streaming this live on Zoom to those all around the world. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you. I'm happy to be, well, first let me introduce myself. My name is Joyce Lee. I'm Head of Policy and Projects at the Global Wind Energy Council. Our stand is just over there. We are a nonprofit industry association promoting wind power all around the world, working particularly in emerging markets for renewable energy. I'm very happy to be joined today by my friend and colleague, John Lezamise, who is the Global Head of Public Affairs at Siemens Gamesa Renewable Energy, and he also chairs GWEC's Africa Task Force. We're also joined virtually in just a second after the presentation by Heba Rabi. She is the Business Development Manager of Lekela Power Egypt, and Heba can tell us a little bit more about who Lekela Power Egypt is when she's with us on screen. So we'd like to begin today with a very short presentation to set the context for why we are looking ahead to COP27. And to do that, it's really about looking a little bit, a few months previous to this, at what we did at COP26. Just a quick note about who we are. GWEC is the global representative body for wind power. On the international scale, we represent the full value chain of wind, from OEMs to developers to the supply chain. We are also an association of associations. So we represent Wind Europe, American Clean Power, the South African Association, the Brazilian, the Chinese associations, and more at the international level in institutions like the UNFCCC, which is the overarching body for the COP framework, as well as the IEA and IRENA, the two major international intergovernmental energy authoritative bodies. What did we do last year for COP26? Last year's campaign marked the biggest international effort on behalf of the wind industry for a COP in more than 1 decade. It marked the return of the wind industry to the storied blue zone of COP. That's the exclusive zone for negotiations, policymakers, and accredited parties to COP since Copenhagen 2009. And this was really the moment for wind to step up again after a decade of incredible cost reduction, after a decade of becoming a mainstream energy source, to be a core part of the conversation on climate change mitigation. And we did this with a group of companies that you can see captured here, forming the Global Wind Energy Coalition for COP26, the leading companies in the sector, as well as the leading industry associations around the world, captured here on the bottom row of this slide. Just a note on, before I talk about the key messages we brought to COP26, just a note on what we saw last year. It was really an inflection point for climate action. We saw net zero become a mainstream concept, not only espoused by the IPCC in its flagship 2018 report, but also picked up by the UN Race to Zero campaign, picked up by state actors and non-state actors, including companies, municipalities, financial institutions, and more, to the point that countries with net zero targets are now covering 88% of global GDP and around 77% of greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. If you start to dig into the net zero conversation, however, it's still fairly shallow. The countries with clear targets and strong plans for net zero cover only 10% of global GDP and 5% of greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. We also saw the COP26 Energy Transition Council formed. This was designed to accelerate clean energy deployment in emerging markets into Africa and Asia, bringing together leading bodies like the IEA and IRENA, as well as the leading multilateral development banks around the world under a COP framework. And we were glad to see that council extended for another 5-year program out to 2025 at the end of last year. In recent months, we've seen 2 major IPCC reports from Working Group 1 and Working Group 3, and these lay out in unequivocal terms the scientific consensus behind human-induced climate change as well as the increasing recognition of adverse impacts of climate change. Finally, from 2021 to 2022, we saw extreme volatility in electricity markets around the world. Preceding the invasion of Ukraine in February, we even saw coal supply scarcity and shortages, stockpiles running low, forced power outages and industrial shutdowns in major economies like China and India as of late last year. And that volatility has only increased following the invasion of Ukraine. Many policymakers now are looking to rewire their energy systems with renewable energy to restore order and energy security. So against this backdrop, we brought these three key messages to the COP audience, which is really national policymakers, the enabling bodies for renewable energy uptake, multilateral development banks, technical advisory bodies, the scientific and academic community, and more. Number one message was around the primary role of renewable energy, and particularly wind energy, in mitigating the harmful impacts of climate change. And we saw those net zero roadmaps published by the IEA and IRENA last year, which show that wind provides by far the most decarbonization potential of any other energy technology, providing around 1/3 of global electricity by 2050 in a net zero compliant world. Number two is really the need to scale up deployment, and I'll talk a little bit about the numbers behind this scale up in just a second. But we saw the acceleration and the momentum for wind energy echoed in roadmaps by energy authorities, by the UN, by the UNFCCC, and this is becoming a sort of resounding call, not just within the industry, but outside the industry too. And finally, we've heard this refrain before, but implementation. We need to go beyond just targets and ambitions and start to move these capacity targets into enabling policy and regulatory frameworks. This is just a picture of what we mounted in the blue zone of COP26 last year. This is the wind pavilion. We were the only energy technology pavilion to be present at COP26, which put forward a very strong foot for wind energy and will be very important to replicate again in Egypt this year. We also engaged with more than 50 different governments being physically present at COP. We had more than 50 bilaterals directly with national policymakers, including the Vietnamese Prime Minister on day one, where at the Wind Pavilion, he announced Vietnam's net zero targets, and he announced the intention to phase out coal by the 2040s. And we also met with numerous energy ministers from around the world, including Kenya, Japan, and other places. On offshore wind, GWEC has partnered with IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, as well as the government of Denmark to launch the Global Offshore Wind Alliance. You can see here, this is the launch on COP TV. This is a new intergovernmental forum, which is designed to raise ambition for offshore wind from mature and emerging markets around the world. So including markets which have already set formidable offshore wind targets, working with them on creating an enabling policy environment, and the next generation of offshore wind countries, such as Brazil, South Africa, India, Australia, New Zealand, and more. We did this under the call to action to mobilize 2,000 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity by 2050, which is the capacity required for a 1.5 degree pathway and a net zero by 2050 pathway. And finally, just a few words about the COP26 conference writ large. Here are a few bullet points about what was included in the milestone Glasgow Climate Pact that was achieved by the end plus one day of COP26. We saw new language on rapidly scaling up the deployment of clean power. We saw new language and agreement on not phasing out, but phasing down unabated coal generation, as well as phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. So we can move away from fossil fuel generation and avoid locking in new fossil fuel generation. We saw requests, so a call to action for parties to the COP framework to increase their NDCs, those are their nationally determined contributions, by the end of this year, instead of on the previous 5-year ratcheting up schedule. We also saw new countries which are dependent on coal make coal phase out pledges, such as Poland, Vietnam, and Chile. There were new initiatives on grid, such as the One Sun, One World, One Grid initiative, merging with the UK's Green Grid initiative. And finally, a lot of language around just transition and financial mechanisms to support early retirement of coal. I think we'll be able to dive into the resilience of the Glasgow Climate Pact in light of recent events during the discussion portion, because there are a few dynamics that may have changed the outlook around phasing out fossil fuel subsidies and investment. Finally, I promised some data, some numbers around the need to scale up wind. This is a graph from our latest Global Wind Report 2022 that we published on Monday this week. What we did was we mapped out the current compound annual growth rate over the next 5 years out to the end of the decade. And we found that at current rates of growth, we're on track to reach just less than 2,000 gigawatts of cumulative capacity around the world by 2030. That gets us to less than 2/3 of the 2030 capacity that's required in a net zero compliant roadmap for wind energy, which means on an annual basis, we need our installations to be scaling up by 4 times over the course of this decade. COP is a very important mobilization mechanism and forum to make this happen. It sets the policy ambition at the highest levels of government and at the global scale to enable this unprecedented degree of growth. So hopefully we'll have a very exciting discussion on what the policies will be to reach that scale. Just a few words on COP27 itself. As noted, it's going to be held in Sharm el-Sheikh in the 2nd and 3rd week of November, and we've included a few points here for consideration about what we expect to be addressed at COP. So number 1 is looking at moving from words to action. That's been a major theme of climate events so far this year, looking at not just raising and ratcheting up NDCs, but moving them into policy frameworks at country level and even subnational level. We also want to revisit this idea about this necessity about phasing out coal generation and fossil fuel subsidies, especially in light of the energy security concerns, which are not expected to abate by November time. We'd like to strengthen this link, use the momentum around this conversation of energy security and a new consensus on renewable energy's role in energy security to firm up wind's role. And then finally, we want to look at expanding onshore and offshore wind to new markets around the world where there's vast amounts of untapped potential that still exist, and including raising technology awareness and raising interest and ambition from the policymakers that attend COP. Finally, there's a few points here around climate finance, the just transition, loss and damage, adaptation, which will definitely be addressed in COP, and I know we'll talk about this today. And then there are certain considerations for what is being framed as an Africa COP. And I think both John and Heba can speak a little bit more about what an Africa COP means in their perspective. So with that, let's move on to the discussion portion of this session. We have about 15 minutes to dive into some of these issues. And I just want to check if we have Heba with us. Great, welcome to the session, Heba. It's a pleasure to have you. I'm just going to dive in because this is a shorter session. And Heba, once we hand the floor to you, it'd be great if you could include a few words about Lekela Power Egypt. But I am going to give the floor first to John. And John, I'm going to ask you this question about a reflection on COP26. There's a lot that's been made about the success, or let's say the partial success of COP26 as the post-Paris COP. In light of the current global energy crisis, which has intensified since COP26, since November, how do you see policy ambition among countries either strengthening or weakening regarding fossil fuel phase out towards the energy transition? John, over to you.
Thank you very much, Joyce, and a pleasure also to be with GWEC and in this, let's say, a COP27 when the current situation, geopolitically speaking, has put energy into the political priority agenda, for sure. I would say that COP26 was partial success because for the first time after the Paris Agreement, rapidly scalable renewables were mentioned. So that was a good opportunity, a great opportunity to recognize the work having been done by the industry and the whole value chain as regards to renewables. But it is true that even being the first COP during or after COVID-19, I think people were eager to, you could feel it, having been both of us in Glasgow, you could feel the ambition and the appetite and how people were eager to collaborate, let's say, from a holistic and global standpoint. Still, instead of phasing out, mentioning phasing down, I think, of course, sometimes diplomacy is not matching with the business ambition. That is true. And also, when you try to reach a global agreement, it is extremely challenging. But I think it was a very, let's say, there was, you could feel that there was an appetite for countries to collaborate and go further. But I think that with the current geopolitical situation, you can feel also in the conference here in Bilbao that politicians have understood how much the private sector is willing to accelerate, not on a PowerPoint, but physically, energy security based on renewables. We are the most, we don't have to invest more to become the most competitive. We are already the most competitive. We have the technology to transition. What we do have to now is put the focus in which are the cornerstones for the transition to happen. It is policy energies related to industrial policies, to trade policies. It is commodities. It is global trade fair, removing trade barriers. It is more about collaborating green technology alliances. So this is where storage, green hydrogen, this is where I think countries should be putting an eye currently, rather than remain talking about fossil fuels. Market forces are going to overcome fossil fuels. We are already there. So we have to put an eye on what really is going to drive the transition.
Thank you, John. So I'm hearing optimism, but also realism regarding these cornerstone pillars: system integration, grid investments, open trade cooperation, and international collaboration to make the transition happen. Heba, over to you. Sitting where you are in Cairo, tell us a bit about Lekela Power Egypt, and as well, are you seeing policy ambition to COP27 strengthening or weakening in the current energy crisis?
Sure. Thanks, Joyce. Can you hear me well? I just want to make sure my mic is working well.
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. Okay. So maybe I can start off with just giving you a very brief introduction to who we are and who Lekela is. So Lekela is a renewable energy developer working mainly on wind projects in Africa. We were founded in 2015 by Actis and a consortium of developers led by Mainstream Power. Currently, we have a focus on 4 main countries in Africa. We work in Ghana, Senegal, South Africa, and Egypt. We currently have over 1 gigawatt of wind projects in our current portfolio. In Egypt, where I'm based, we own and operate a 250 megawatt wind farm in the Gulf of Suez. The wind farm is called the West Buck Wind Farm, and it's around 30 kilometers away from the city of Ras Gharib. So that's basically who we are in a nutshell. To answer your question, Joyce, I'm going to speak more about the Egyptian perspective. In the case of Egypt, I think there has been a very clear move towards strengthening government policy towards energy transition. First, I need to mention, of course, Egypt has a very ambitious renewable energy strategy, which sets a goal for reaching 42% of its electricity from renewable energy sources by 2035. There's also been talks now about even increasing that to 62% by 2035, although that has not been confirmed yet. So definitely there's a lot of appetite for renewable energy in Egypt. And you mentioned coal. In terms of coal, over the past 2 years, there have been a number of proposed coal plants that have been replaced by renewable energy projects, and specifically wind projects. So one example of that is the Hamra coal plant. That was said to be the world's 2nd biggest coal plant. This project was postponed indefinitely and replaced with a 1.1 gigawatt wind farm, which is currently being developed by Aqua Power and Hassan Alan Utilities. Another example is the Ayoun Moussa coal plant, which was said to be developed by El Nuais. That was also cancelled and replaced with 700 megawatts worth of renewable energy, split into two projects, a 200 megawatt solar and a 500 megawatt wind, both in the Gulf of Suez region. So I'm just giving you examples of initiatives with coal retirement in Egypt. So that's coal. Another important point to mention, also from a very strategic perspective, Egypt has been working very hard on its green desalination strategy. Early in 2021, the government announced that all new desalination projects would rely on renewable energy sources. The government plans to increase Egypt's desalination capacity to 6.4 million cubic meters per day by 2050. Compare that to our current capacity, which is only around 800,000 cubic meters per day. If you do the math, you'll realize that this will require a very large scale rollout of new renewable energy projects, both solar and wind. Also, of course, we need to mention, like a lot of other countries, Egypt is currently developing its own green hydrogen strategy and is in talks with numerous key strategy players on potential green hydrogen projects in Egypt. Another thing worth mentioning is that Egypt is currently positioning itself as a green energy hub. So we're not only looking at green transition, but also going a step further and positioning ourselves as a regional green energy hub. I'm sure many of you have heard about the Euro-Africa interconnector. So this is a subsea cable which will connect Egypt to Europe through Cyprus and Greece. This will allow Egypt to make use of its huge renewable energy potential to export clean energy to Europe. And now, of course, in light of the current developments, I believe this will become a very important project. So yes, I mean, to answer your question, Joyce, in a nutshell, yes, I think countries are definitely strengthening their policies towards energy transition. Egypt is working very hard on that. And I think given that it's the next COP27 host country, I think we're trying to lead by example.
Great. Thank you so much, Heba. It's a very encouraging response. And congratulations as well on the recent inauguration of the West Bakr wind farm. Congratulations to Siemens Gamesa as well, as the turbines are deployed on that wind farm. I think what you mentioned about the Aqua Power project being coal to wind is quite an interesting scheme. Quite a lot has been made about coal retirement mechanisms, ensuring the right guardrails are in place. The Asian Development Bank, for instance, announced its coal retirement mechanism at COP26 last year, piloted in Indonesia and the Philippines, where some of the youngest coal plants globally are based. And there's going to be a lot of scrutiny of how this coal retirement, how coal asset owners are remunerated to retire their assets early. But this is another scheme to guarantee offtake to a coal developer who could also develop wind in place of coal on the same site. So an interesting scheme being piloted by Egypt there. I know we only have about 5 minutes. I do want to hand it to the audience as well for questions. I'm going to ask one question more of John and Heba, and if anyone else does have a question, please raise your hand and we'll make sure that a roving mic can reach you so you can ask your question to John and Heba too. Very quickly, maybe a 2-minute response, John. As chair of GWEC's Africa Task Force, in your words, what do you expect from an Africa COP this year?
Well, I think we have a tremendous opportunity. Under the current scenario, we all feel, I mean, giving you some data as well, Spain has a 47 million people country, and we have 27 gigawatts of wind power installed. If we compare with Africa, Africa has 1.2 billion people, and it is only 8 gigawatts of wind power installed. So I think we have a great opportunity because COP, it is the first COP in Africa first. It is, because of the current momentum, talking about energy security, talking about energy transition, is not only letting the African lead, but it is a joint partnership between the overall world in Africa. For me, it is the crucial opportunity that we have to put Africa as a priority. And as we have been speaking about the Paris Agreement, about the Glasgow Climate Pact, for me it could be fantastic to have a Egypt Climate Disruptive Pact. For me, from a marketing campaign point of view and from a policy point of view, I think we cannot miss the opportunity for Africa and with Africa. That could be my 2-minute discourse, if I may.
Thank you, John. And Heba, over to you. Sitting in Egypt, what does an Africa COP mean to you?
Thanks, Joyce. Yes, important question. I think, you know, Egypt as an African country, I think this is the first time COP has been in an African country since I think Marrakesh. So, you know, we belong to a continent that is one of the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Egypt, for example, is one of the top 5 countries that is vulnerable to climate change, which was actually a shocking news to me. However, of course, this continent is also one of the least emitters. So I think Egypt this year will really want to focus and highlight issues that really matter to Africa. First and foremost, adaptation and resilience to climate change. Issues such as, you know, rising sea levels, water stress, loss and degradation, impact even on farmer livelihood and agriculture are all going to be really high up there on the agenda for this COP. Historically, there's always been more focus on mitigation than adaptation. For example, even in Egypt, if you look at the Egyptian ODA portfolio, you'll see that $2.8 billion have been invested in climate adaptation, which sounds like a very big number. But if you compare that to 7.8 billion that has been invested in mitigation, you will notice that there is a skew towards mitigation, even in Egypt. So this, you know, I think that Egypt will really want to stress the importance of adaptation for this COP, for a continent that is as vulnerable as Africa, and to have more of an equal balance between mitigation and adaptation efforts. So that's one thing. Moving on from that, and secondly, and actually just as important, and I think, Joyce, you've mentioned this already, the issue of moving from pledges and commitments to actual, you know, to action, to implementation, like you said. And to make this happen, I think Egypt will really want to discuss how to break down these barriers to climate finance. Most of the countries that would benefit the most from climate finance are the ones that have the most barriers, obviously. The Egyptian government wants to discuss how the international climate community can de-risk these green projects in the countries that need them the most. And of course, you know, I think there's a very big role for the international development banks to play alongside the private sector, working together to identify what these barriers are and how to break them. One of the barriers we hear a lot about is the lack of capacity in African countries, right? So again, what can we do as an international community to build capacity for green projects in these countries to increase chances of projects being bankable? Egypt also wants to leverage on the success stories of implemented projects that can be used as best practice and can be replicated in other countries. So for example, Egypt will be using Lekela's West Bank project as a success story, as it was able to receive 3 of the top international development bank funding from IFC, EBRD, and DFC, for example. So yes, I mean, just to wrap up very quickly and summarize, 2 main focuses for Egypt this year is definitely adaptation and turning commitments into something a bit more tangible.
Great, thank you, Heba. I really like that response. What can the industry do at COP27 to ensure that we support the mobilization of private investments and best practices as much as possible to accelerate renewables across the African continent? At the same time, we need to be there with sensitivity to the issues around vulnerability to climate change, around the conversation of fair shares, where developing economies who have not been responsible historically for the majority of captured emissions in the atmosphere are being asked to step up on now an annual basis in terms of their NDCs and commitments. And I think this goes back to that $100 billion undelivered climate finance pledge from developed countries to developing countries, which I'm sure we'll see many messages on in November this year. I think because you've mentioned adaptation, I did want to end on one quote. I'm just scanning the audience to see if there are any questions. I don't think there are. So I'm just going to wrap up this session with one quote around adaptation and mitigation. And this is a quote from John Holdren. He was the climate advisor to former President Barack Obama. And he, in 2007, at the launch of an IPCC report, said this: "We basically have 3 choices: mitigation, adaptation, and suffering. We're going to do some of each. The question is what the mix is going to be. The more mitigation we do, the less adaptation will be required and the less suffering there will be. So I think while this conversation on COP27 is going to heavily draw upon loss and damage and adaptation issues, it is utterly critical that the industry is there to deliver the messages on mitigation and we don't take our foot off the pedal. I think with that, let's bring this session to a close. If you are interested in learning more about COP27 and UX activities there, please contact us. Come find us at our stand just next door. Thank you all so much for joining us live as well as online, and wish you a great rest of your day.
Thank you.